The first thing guests noticed when they stepped into Magnolia and Company wasn't the scent of buttered rosemary rolls, or the gentle piano notes that fluttered like feathers through the air. It was a silence, not the absence of sound, but a curated, intentional hush, like the quiet between heartbeats. The kind of hush that made people stand a little straighter, whisper a little softer, and believe, if only for a night, that they belonged somewhere grand. Located just off King Street in Charleston, the restaurant was a relic and a reinvention. White tablecloths, glass chandeliers that dripped light like dew, and a baby grand piano nestled beside a marble fireplace. It wasn't just upscale. It was aspirational. And everyone who worked there knew it. Amira Wells moved through the space like breath, noticed and unnoticed all at once. Her black apron was pressed, her white shirt immaculate, her hair tied back in a long, neat twist. Her name tag glinted subtly in the golden light, but few guests ever needed to read it. Everyone remembered Amira, not because she talked too much, she rarely did, but because she listened like their stories mattered, because her presence made even the loneliest diners feel less alone. She walks like music, one regular once said, and no one questioned it. Amira worked table 6 that evening, a couple celebrating an anniversary, a lawyer from Columbia, and an elderly widower who came every Friday for the same red blend and tomato bisque. She moved from table to table with the ease of someone who didn't just know the rhythm of the restaurant. She shaped it. Her smile was practiced, yes, but never plastic. Her posture perfect, but never rigid. She spoke only when needed, but always with warmth. People said she had grace. What they didn't know was that she'd earned it. Note by note, chord by chord, silence by silence. In the corner of the dining room, the pianist played a lilting piece in D major, soft enough not to interrupt conversations, strong enough to wrap itself around the room like a velvet scarf. Amira's fingers, as she laid a bread basket down, tapped out a few matching notes on the linen-covered edge of the table. Just muscle memory. No one noticed. And that was exactly how she liked it. Amira had been working at Magnolia and Company for 18 months. Long enough to become indispensable. Long enough to become invisible. Too, in the way all great servers are, present when needed, gone when not. But if anyone had watched closely, if they'd really paid attention, they would have seen something different in her rhythm. The pauses, the way she lingered near the piano, the way her eyes softened when a guest complimented a particular classical piece. She knew them all, not just by name or composer. She knew their architecture, the way the notes bent toward each other, the gravity of crescendos, the silence that followed a suspended chord. What the world didn't know, what even her closest co-workers didn't realize, was that Amira Wells had once been a prodigy. Carnegie Hall, age 19. A performance of Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit that had critics using words like otherworldly and devastating. A scholarship at Juilliard. Features in glossy music magazines with headlines like The Girl Who Made Chopin Cry Again. But that life had been folded into boxes and stored away. Long before Magnolia. Long before she carried plates instead of programs. Only her hands remembered. At 9:17 p.m., Amira stood by the POS screen, entering orders with practiced precision. Behind her, the piano trailed off into silence as the current song came to an end. The pianist, Robert, took a sip of water and nodded to her as she passed. She returned it. They weren't friends exactly, but there was mutual respect. Musicians, even ones undercover. "You ever play?" he once asked weeks ago, catching her watching his fingers. She just smiled and said, "I serve better than I play." It was easier that way. In the back hallway between the kitchen and the main dining room, Rose, a veteran waitress in her 60s, paused beside Amira while filling water glasses. "Quiet night," Rose whispered, glancing toward the piano. Amira nodded. "Feels stiller than usual." "Could be the rain," Rose said, "or just the calm before the rich folks show up. They love storming in after 9:30 with last-minute reservations and loud opinions." They both chuckled quietly, but Amira knew better. It wasn't the weather. There was a different kind of shift tonight. The kind of shift that musicians feel before the key changes. That tremble in the breath before the downbeat. At 9:42, as Amira carried a tray of desserts past the bar, the front doors opened. A blast of Charleston's humid night air pushed into the room, and with it, something colder, presence. The kind of presence that didn't walk in, but arrived. The kind of presence that made the pianist look up mid-note and hesitate. In walked a man in a tailored gray suit, followed by 5 others dressed like they just walked out of shareholders' meeting. The leader walked slowly, deliberately. His eyes scanned the room not like a guest, but like a buyer. Griffin Halstead. Amira recognized him immediately, not from TV, but from reputation. The man who once got a hostess fired for folding his napkin incorrectly. The mogul who was banned from a competing restaurant for humiliating a busboy over silverware placement. He had the kind of wealth that believed service staff were just background noise. And tonight, he was about to sit in her section. The rain had started by the time Amira got home. It tapped softly on a rusted railing outside her apartment window, a gentle rhythm that might have soothed anyone else. But not her. Not tonight. She stepped inside, kicked off her black flats, and tossed her apron onto the counter, like it weighed more than it should. Her tiny kitchen smelled faintly of peppermint tea and old lemon polish. Everything in the apartment was small, tidy, quiet, a well-curated silence. But one thing stood out in the corner, a digital piano, barely lit by the orange streetlight bleeding through the blinds, covered in a thin layer of dust, not because she neglected it, but because she couldn't risk waking her neighbors. This piano didn't sing aloud anymore. It whispered, only through headphones. She stared at it. Her fingers itched. She didn't play every night, only when she needed to breathe. And after the night, after seeing Griffin Halstead scan the dining room like it was an auction block, she needed more than air. She needed music. Amira sat on the bench, plugged in her headphones, and placed her hands gently on the keys. Her back straightened out of instinct. She adjusted her wrists without thinking. And then she began. Not scales, not Chopin, not even the jazz improvisation she sometimes used to warm up. She played nothing, at least not at first. Instead, S.H. let her fingers rest there, remembering what they once did without hesitation, remembering how they once danced under the weight of real ivory, on stages framed with velvet curtains and spotlights and the scent of freshly tuned strings. Back then, her name, Amira Wells, was whispering conservatories like a promise. That girl's gonna change classical music, one Juilliard professor told the Times. She doesn't just play it, she resurrects it. They called her hands impossibly light, her tempo flawless, her interpretations haunting. But those words didn't feed her mother when chemo bills came, and they didn't mean much to hospital administrators asking for signatures. The last time Amira had played without headphones was in the hospital chapel, late at night, when the halls emptied and the world quieted just enough to believe in something more than pain. Her mother had been asleep upstairs, and Amira had played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major with tears slipping down her cheeks. Quiet tears, like the notes. No one heard. No one clapped. And maybe that was the point. Now, in her apartment, she finally began. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, first movement, slow, intimate, like a confession whispered through keys. It wasn't a performance. It was a release. By the time the piece ended, Amira's breath had evened, but her heart had not. She pulled the headphones off and sat in the quiet of the room, hands still on the keys. There was always a pause after she played. A question. What if I had stayed? What if I had pushed for scholarships, gone back after the funeral, kept performing? But she knew the answer. Life doesn't wait for grieving, and dreams don't come with health insurance. So she stayed in Charleston, got the first job she could. Waitress. Magnolia and Company. The irony wasn't lost on her. A grand piano sat in the corner of that restaurant. Polished every night. Played every night. But never by her. That was someone else's job. Her job was to refill glasses, memorize birthdays, deliver steak medium rare, and keep her past folded like sheet music. Out of sight, out of mind. She stood up and walked to her fridge, grabbed a bottle of water, and leaned against the counter. Across the room, The piano sat quietly, like it too had just confessed something it shouldn't have. A notification buzzed on her phone. A new comment on a live stream from Magnolia's social media page. She clicked. It was just a customer's video, barely a minute long. Robert playing a jazz standard that night, while diners sipped wine and smiled. In the corner of the frame, Amira could be seen, placing a plate down, nodding politely. Invisible, just the way she liked it. But there was one person who hadn't looked away. One person who had stared directly through her all evening. Griffin Halstead. He didn't know she played. Of course not. He didn't see waitresses, only price tags. But Amira had seen his expression shift when the music stopped. Brief, subtle, but it was there. He noticed when it was gone. That meant something. Because tomorrow, when she clocked in at Magnolia again, the piano would still be there. So would the chandelier, the glassware, the guests with names like Winthrop and Carrington. And Griffin? He'd be back. Amira finished her water and walked over to the window. Rain dripped down the glass in slow lines. On the street below, the city hummed like it always did. History in every brick, ghosts in every corner. But in her apartment, she was more alive than she had been all week, because she had played, and because something in her, deep and unsilenced, was whispering. Tomorrow might be different. Tomorrow, someone might listen. Tomorrow, she might not stay silent. Friday nights at Magnolia and Company ran like sheet music, measured, elegant, predictable. The doors opened at 5 sharp, and by 7 p.m., the dining room filled with a soft clink of silverware, the low murmur of expensive conversations, and the steady cadence of jazz or classical piano flowing from the grand in the corner. Tonight was no different. At least, not yet. Amira Wells buttoned the last snap on her pressed black vest and tied her apron with practiced precision. Her reflection in the kitchen's brushed metal panels stared back at her, composed, quiet, contained. She checked her table assignments, nodded a silent good luck to Rose across the server station, and stepped onto the floor just as the first familiar notes drifted from the baby grand. Robert, the pianist, was playing something slow and smoky. Misty, maybe. His fingers moved smoothly, a little looser than usual, but still elegant. The room responded instantly. Conversations softened. Guests leaned into each other. Wine tasted better under the spell of melody. Amira smiled to herself. Even if no one clapped, everyone felt the music. That was the magic of Magnolia. At 7:26 p.m., table 12 needed extra bread. Got it, Amira said before Mike could even finish asking. She moved quickly but unhurriedly, already mapping her path across the floor. She passed the hostess stand, weaved through table 7, paused at 4 to top off a water glass, and made it to the bread station just as the oven pinged. Efficiency wasn't just her skill, it was her armor. But as she arranged the bread into a wicker basket, she heard something that pulled her attention immediately. A missed note, then another. Robert never missed. She turned, just enough to glance over her shoulder. The music had slowed oddly. His left hand dragged slightly behind the right, like a tired conversation trying to catch up. She saw him shift on the bench, wipe his forehead, then stop playing altogether. The silence hit the room like a power outage. Robert stood up, gave a brief nod toward the front, and disappeared down the hallway near the manager's office. Amira watched him go, her heartbeat sinking to the uncomfortable stillness that followed. Without the piano, the restaurant sounded different, sharper. The clink of ice in glasses, the occasional forced laughter, the scrape of a chair leg across hardwood, all of it now naked without music to dress it. Amira resumed her steps, delivering the bread basket with a smile, but she felt it. So did the guests. And when she passed by the piano on her next round, she couldn't help but glance at the keys. Still, untouched, glinting beneath the chandelier light, like a secret no one dared to speak. At 8:11 p.m., Amira overheard the update from behind the bar. Robert's going home. Says he's nauseous and seeing spots. Seriously? Tonight? Yeah, said he nearly passed out. The bartender muttered something under his breath, then resumed polishing glasses. Amira didn't comment. She just nodded and walked away. But inside, she knew something had shifted, By 8:30, the mood in the restaurant had grown strange. No one said it aloud, but the guests were restless. Even the food seemed to arrive with less grandeur. The absence of music stripped away something Magnolia had always offered: a soft edge, a sense of occasion. It was like attending a wedding reception with no first dance. At one table, a woman in pearls asked if they'd be playing music again soon. At another, a guest joked that it felt like eating in a library. Amira heard it all, took the comments in stride, smiled, assured them the issue was being handled, but she could feel the tension building like an unresolved chord. By 9:03, Amira stood behind the hostess podium, refilling her notepad when she saw it. The glass doors at the front of Magnolia swung open, and in walked Griffin Halstead. It wasn't just his entrance. It was the way the staff subtly changed the moment they saw him. Shoulders straightened, conversations hushed. Tommy, the young host, looked like he'd just swallowed ice water. Griffin walked like he owned the place. Technically, he didn't, but you wouldn't know that by the way he moved, eyes scanning the room not for ambience but for flaws. Behind him, 5 sharply dressed people followed. 2 men, 2 women, and a man in a charcoal blazer glued to his phone. They were here for dinner. They were also here to be seen. Tommy approached Griffin with practiced charm. "Good evening, Mr. Halstead. Welcome to Magnolia. We're honored to have you." Griffin didn't bother responding. He just said, "Table?" Tommy led them to the only large booth available, a mirror section. Her stomach sank slightly, but she didn't flinch. She adjusted her apron and approached like she would any table. "Good evening," she said warmly. "Welcome to Magnolia. May I offer you sparkling or still to begin?" Griffin didn't even look up. "Don't waste my time with options. Sparkling. Cold. Fast." The guest at his table chuckled awkwardly. Amira nodded. "Of course." As she turned, she caught the eye of the woman in the blue suit. The woman offered a slight, sympathetic smile, just enough to say, "I'm sorry for him." Back in the kitchen, Rose muttered, "Halstead's in your section? God help you." Amira gave a faint smirk, wiped her hands, and moved to pour the sparkling water. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing. Without music, Magnolia felt brittle. And with Griffin Halstead in the room, it wouldn't take much for something crack. The air in Magnolia and Company always smelled faintly of warm butter, sea salt, and sophistication. But when Griffin Halstead entered the dining room, something else drifted in too: power. And something colder: entitlement. Amira Wells felt it immediately. It wasn't loud, but it was undeniable, like the hum of a storm before it strikes. Griffin didn't walk. He surveyed, as if each table, each linen napkin, each guest was something to assess, not experience. His tailored gray suit was immaculate. His gold cufflinks caught the chandelier light. His watch, some limited edition piece of mirror couldn't name, reflected off the crystal water glasses as he took his seat. But it wasn't just what he wore. It was what he carried with him. The expectation to be obeyed. Amira approached his table with the same warmth and grace she gave every guest, but her senses were heightened. Every move needed to be exact. People like Griffin weren't just guests. They were lit matches in a room of silk. "Welcome again, Mr. Halstead," she said, her voice calm, measured. "Would you like to begin with wine this evening?" He didn't look at her, just flicked a hand dismissively. "Bring your most expensive bottle of red. 2 of them." She paused a beat. "Yes, sir." As she turned to go, she heard him mutter under his breath, just loud enough for those around him, and for her, to hear. God, even the servers here have scripts. You'd think we were at a wedding, not a restaurant. Laughter followed, thin and forced. One of his guests, a woman in a deep blue suit, winced. Another man looked down at his napkin. Amira didn't flinch. Years of service had taught her how to wear dignity like armor. But still, something under her ribs tightened. Back at the bar, she pulled requested bottles. A 2015 Brunello, aged in oak, retailing at nearly $350 each. "Damn," said Marcus, the bartender, as she checked corks. "That man doesn't order. He announces." Amira gave a quiet smile. He's the kind that buys presents. Marcus nodded. And demands performance. By the time Amira returned to the table with the wine, Griffin was already fidgeting with the silverware. About time, he said flatly, eyes still on his phone. You'd think for the price of this place, they'd serve faster. Without a word, Amira presented the bottle, opened it with flawless technique, and poured just enough for a taste. Griffin glanced up, finally, and took the glass. He sniffed, swirled, sipped, then sneered. It'll do, he muttered. I've had better, but at least it's not box. Again, laughter, louder this time, though even more uncomfortable. As Amira moved through the rest of the restaurant, she couldn't help but notice how the energy at Griffin's table spread like oil across water. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was disruptive. They sent back the bread too dry, asked for a different tablecloth. This one feels too stiff. The temperature was wrong. The lighting was off. And most of all, Griffin kept asking the same question over and over again. Where's the damn music? At first, Amira offered the standard response. Our pianist had a health emergency, sir. He had to leave early. But Griffin didn't accept that. He grinned. Isn't that convenient? At 9:40, Amira was clearing dishes from table 6 when she saw Griffin lean back in his chair, holding his wine glass like a trophy. He tapped it gently with a fork. The ring of crystal cut through the air. The dining room turned. Forks froze. Conversations halted. Griffin stood. Well, he said, raising his voice, I must say, this place is nothing if not charming. Elegant chandeliers, pretentious bread, waitstaff with rehearsed lines. But there's something missing, wouldn't you all agree? A ripple of chuckles from a few tables. But most guests watched with uneasy curiosity. He gestured dramatically to the silent grand piano in the corner. No music, no atmosphere, just the hum of mediocre service. His words stabbed the air and landed. Amira felt her cheeks flush, but not from shame, from fury. Griffin continued, but perhaps we can fix that. He reached into his coat, pulled out a thick leather wallet, and produced a crisp stack of hundreds. A murmur ran through the room. He slapped the bills on the table. $10,000, right here, in cash. Every server stopped mid-step. The hostess dropped a menu. If anyone, any staff member in this place, can sit at that piano and play something real, something classical, something that doesn't make my ears bleed, this money is theirs. Gasps, some laughs, mostly silence. This isn't a handout, he said, pacing now. It's a challenge, a little game. Prove this place is class, that it doesn't just hire people who memorize drink orders and can't spell Beethoven. He turned slowly, deliberately, until his eyes landed on one person. Amira, you, he said, smirking. You've got nice hands. What do you think? Can you do more than pour wine? Or are you just another background extra? Amira stood frozen. A dozen pairs of eyes turned to her. Guests, co-workers, even Tommy, the host, looked like he was ready to throw himself between them. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Griffin stepped closer. I'll even film it, he said, pulling out his phone. Might go viral. Waitress tries to play chopsticks. A few people chuckled nervously. Most didn't. Across the restaurant, Rose was near tears. In the kitchen, the chef had stopped mid-saute, his fists clenched around the handle of his pan. And in the center of it all, Amira stood still, her face calm. But inside, a fire was waking up. She looked past Griffin, past the sneers, past the bills. Her eyes found the piano. It was waiting. She hadn't touched a real one in years, but it hadn't forgotten her, and she hadn't forgotten it. When power mocks, talent remembers. The bills sat on the white linen tablecloth like a crown of arrogance, crisp, immaculate, and stacked with performative flair. $10,000 meant not to reward, but to reduce. Griffin Halstead leaned back in his chair, arms folded like a director waiting for the curtain to rise. The room had returned to normal since the spectacle. It couldn't. The wine had stopped flowing. Forks hovered, untouched, and silence thick and uneasy, had reclaimed the air where music used to live. Except now, instead of Chopin, the only soundtrack was tension. Amira stood at the edge of his table, still holding a tray with 2 untouched dessert menus. The corners of her mouth twitched, like she was holding back a truth, and perhaps a scream. Griffin looked up at her again. "Still here?" he said mockingly. "I thought you'd be halfway to the piano by now." Or is E-flat major a little too advanced for Charleston's finest waitstaff? More laughter. "Cool. Shallow." The woman in the blue suit gave a tight shake of her head, her face burning with secondhand embarrassment. A man at a nearby table muttered under his breath, "What jackass!" But no one intervened, because this was what money did. It bought attention. It bought permission. It turned people into props. And Amira Wells was being positioned center stage. She set the tray down quietly and straightened her posture. Her hands rested calmly at her sides, but her knuckles were white. "I'm here to do my job," she said softly. Griffin smirked. "Then let's expand the job description, shall we? Play a little ditty for us. Surprise me." He reached for his phone, opening the camera app. "Let's see if we can get you a few TikTok views." The audacity hung in the air like cheap cologne. Across the dining room, Rose stood frozen beside a booth, napkin still draped over her arm. Her eyes were glassy. In the kitchen, the head chef, Mateo, slammed a pan down with just enough force to rattle the nearby spice rack. "This is a damn circus," he growled. And Tommy, still stationed near the host stand, had gone pale. He took one step forward, then another, lips parted to say something, but stopped. Because what could he say? Griffin Halstead wasn't just rich. He was connected. The kind of man who got restaurants shut down over cold appetizers. The kind of man who laughed louder when he knew everyone else was uncomfortable. Griffin rose from his chair, taking a step toward the grand piano in the corner. His voice carried again. $10,000, he called out to the whole room. "Right here. For anyone who can walk over to that beautiful Steinway, sit down, and play something that even vaguely resembles real music." He turned and looked at Amira. "Unless you're scared." That word, that tone, wasn't just condescension. It was a trigger. One Amira had known her whole life. Scared, timid, quiet, weak, invisible. She'd heard all those words before. From judges, from critics, even from other musicians who mistook silence for submission. But she wasn't scared. She was calculating. Because standing in front of Griffin in this expensive restaurant, surrounded by silent witnesses and clinking glasses that now felt like metronomes, she realized something. This wasn't just a bad night. This was a test. Griffin placed a stack of bills gently on top of the piano lid, then turned dramatically to face the crowd like a game show host. "Come on, don't be shy. Show me this restaurant has culture." He gestured again to Amira. "Come on, Miss Wells, is it? You've got the look. Let's see if you got the fingers." Another round of forced laughter. Amira felt every gaze in the room pierce through her like heat. She could see the shift happening. Diners who once saw her only as a server now watched her like a contestant. One of Griffin's associates leaned in and whispered, "Maybe you should cool it, Griff. This isn't playing well." Griffin waved him off. They'll forget about it by dessert. But Amira wouldn't, and neither would the people who finally saw her. The chandelier lights glinted across the piano lid, catching her eye. Her hands began to tingle, a sensation she hadn't felt since Juilliard. It wasn't nerves. It was muscle memory, a quiet surge of purpose. The last time she felt it, her mother was still alive, sitting in the front row, proud eyes brimming with tears as Amira performed Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor in front of a sold-out auditorium. Now, she stood in an upscale southern restaurant, being mocked for sport. But the piano was still a piano, and she was still a musician. She stepped forward, slowly, just a half step. Griffin raised an eyebrow. "There we go," he said. "Didn't think you'd take the bait." But Amira wasn't stepping toward him. She was stepping toward herself. Tommy turned to Rose and whispered, "Is she really gonna?" Rose nodded slowly, a smile tugging at the edge of her lips. "Watch her," she whispered back. "Just watch." Griffin chuckled. "What's it gonna be, sweetheart?" chopsticks or hot cross buns. Amira turned her gaze to him fully for the first time that night. Her voice was low. Even. I'll play, she said. Griffin's smirk widened. But not for you, she added, eyes narrowing. Not for your camera. Not for your money. She walked past him, and the dining room went silent again. But this time, it wasn't because of fear. It was anticipation. It was never about the music. It was about the message. The hush that spread through Magnolia, and company was no longer passive. It was charged. It had weight. It wrapped around the walls, pressed against the windows, and pooled beneath the grand piano like fog before a storm. The elegant dining room had become a stage, and everyone, diners, servers, bartenders, even the chef peeking from the kitchen door, was now an audience, captive and waiting. Amira Wells stood in the middle of it all, one foot still near Griffin's table, the other already pointed toward the piano, her spine straight, her jaw set, her hands relaxed, but barely. Across the room, Griffin Halstead was eating up the attention like it was a 5-course meal. He spread his arms theatrically. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, what you're witnessing tonight is the restoration of culture. Some clapped. Not many. Most were too stunned to do anything but stare. Griffin walked over to the piano and, with exaggerated care, spread the $10,000 out across the lid like he was dealing poker chips. Hundreds, all crisp, perfectly stacked. The act was deliberate. This wasn't a prize. It was bait. This, he said, tapping the money, goes to any staff member who can play something worth listening to. Classical, not pop, not happy birthday, not whatever they heard on TikTok last week. He smirked. And let's be clear, this isn't about mediocrity. This is about talent, about refinement, about culture. He drew the last word out like it belonged to him. Near the kitchen, Chef Mateo whispered under his breath, "Son of a..." Rose grabbed his arm gently, eyes locked on Amira. "Let her handle it," she whispered. "Let her decide." Griffin turned back to the staff. "Where's the courage?" he called. "Where's the showmanship? Where's the proof that this restaurant deserves its reputation?" Then, finally, he looked back to Amira. "You said you play." He stepped aside from the piano, gesturing like a magician, unveiling a trick. "So play." Amira didn't move. Not yet. She studied the scene. Griffin's smug grin. The camera in his hand already rolling. The stack of bills gleaming under the chandelier light. She looked at the guests. Many of them were sympathetic. Others looked away, ashamed. A few held up phones, filming. Not to humiliate her, but to capture whatever happened next. Still, it felt like a trap, because it was. This wasn't just a rich man testing a waitress. This was a power game. He wanted to see someone small squirm. A beat passed. Then Amira spoke, softly, but clearly. "Who's the performance for, Mr. Halstead?" she asked. "Them? Yourself? Or the internet?" Griffin raised an eyebrow. "Don't deflect. It's a simple offer. You either can or you can't." "It's not about can," she said. He laughed. "So it's won't. That's fine too. You walk away, and everyone knows the answer." Someone in the room gasped. A woman at table 4 shook her head slowly. Amira took one step toward the piano. Then another. She was calm, but the air around her crackled. Griffin's camera tracked her as she approached the bench. "Smile," he whispered. "You're about to go viral." She stopped walking, turned, faced him fully. "No," she said, "I won't play for mockery. Or money. I'm not your entertainment." Her voice, though quiet, slammed into the silence. Griffin's smile faltered just for a second, but before he could recover, a young busboy, no older than 19, stepped out from behind the bar and said, "Miss Amira, if you do want to play, we'll all be with you." A whisper rippled through the room. Someone clapped once, then another, then silence again, but not the same kind of silence. This one was waiting, hopeful, holding its breath. Amira turned back to the piano. She looked at the keys. She could almost hear them, calling her not as weapons, not as tools, as truth. But she didn't sit yet. Not yet. She turned back to Griffin, who was now visibly annoyed that his performance wasn't going the way he'd planned. "You think this proves something?" she asked him. "That you can wave cash around and own the room? That art is something to purchase, like square footage?" Griffin scoffed. "I think it proves reality. That everyone's got a price. Even pride." Amira's smile was barely perceptible. Then she said, "Then you clearly don't understand music." She walked to the bench. Finally, the crowd leaned forward, quiet, reverent. Griffin moved to sit, muttering to his phone, "This'll be good." He tapped the screen. Still recording. Amira sat, adjusted the bench by feel alone. Her fingers hovered over keys. They trembled, not from fear, but from memory. In her mind, the notes were already forming, rising through muscle, through grief, through resolve. But still, she didn't play. Not yet. She placed both hands on her lap. And then, she reached forward, slowly, and gathered the money off the lid of the piano. Every eye in the room widened. Even Griffin sat up straighter. She walked the stack back to his table. Set it down gently. "Keep it," she said. "I'm not doing this for your ego." Griffin stared at her. Amira returned to piano. Sat down again. This time, with nothing between her and the music but silence. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. She was used to being watched. But this time, they were waiting to judge or to believe. The silence before the first note was long enough to become a question. Would she do it? Could she? And if she did, would it be a performance or a revelation? Amira Wells sat on the velvet bench like she belonged there, because once upon a time, she had. But this wasn't Carnegie Hall. This wasn't a recital. This was a war zone disguised in white linen and candlelight. And she was a target. Or maybe she was a fuse. All eyes in Magnolia and company were fixed on her. Not just the diners and servers, but the kitchen staff, half hidden behind the swinging doors. The valet who had slipped back inside. The dishwasher peeking around the corner, apron soaked but gaze unblinking. Even Griffin Halstead, the man who tried to turn her into a sideshow, had gone still. His camera was rolling, yes, but his smirk had cooled into something else. Curiosity? Doubt? He didn't know anymore. He had expected panic, not poise. Amira didn't touch the keys yet. Instead, she inhaled a full breath, a quiet one, the kind a performer takes not to calm themselves, but to center the storm inside. Because there was a storm. Griffin had mocked her in front of dozens, called her out with the cold cruelty of a man who thought money made him invincible. He had looked at her, a black waitress, and seen someone small, someone dispensable, someone who should bow or walk away. He hadn't expected her to fight back with silence. He hadn't expected her to sit down at the piano not for $10,000, but for something he would never understand. Dignity. Her fingers hovered above the keys. Just slightly. She could feel her pulse in her wrists. Not fear. Momentum. Then she looked up. And in that moment, she saw everything. The woman in the blue suit who had once looked embarrassed was now biting her lip, holding her phone but not recording, just watching. Really watching. The elderly couple near table 5 sat motionless. The wife gripped her husband's hand. He nodded at Amira like he'd known her forever. Tommy, the young host, had both hands pressed against his chest. Even Rose, tough as nails Rose, was wiping the corner of her eye with a bar napkin. But the most arresting gaze was Griffin's. Smug, yes, but unsettled. He was afraid, not of Amira, but of what would happen if he had been wrong. Amira didn't flinch. She let her hands drop into position, and for a fraction of a second, she was no longer in a restaurant. She was in a hospital chapel, fingers dancing across an old upright while her mother slept upstairs, tubes in her arm and hope in her eyes. She was in a conservatory, age 19, playing Rachmaninoff for professors who forgot to breathe. She was on the floor of her apartment at 3 a.m., headphones on, playing not for applause but for remembrance. Now she was here, back in the real world, about to show them all. Griffin's voice broke through. One last jab, desperate. "You've got a real flair for drama," he said, louder than necessary. "Let's hope your playing isn't all build-up." A few chuckles, but fewer than before. Even his table wasn't laughing now. Amira looked at him, not with defiance, but with something sharper. Pity. Then she turned back to the piano. She pressed her first note. It rang out like a whisper spoken in a cathedral. Clear, unapologetic. A single key, followed by a second, then a third, forming the opening bars of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the last piece she had played for her mother before everything changed. The moment that note filled the room, something inside it changed too. The tension didn't vanish. It transformed. The air turned reverent. Phones were lowered. Hands were clasped. Hearts held still. As Amira played, her eyes closed, not to shut out the room, but to let the music find its way. Because it wasn't just notes she was playing. It was memory. It was grief. It was resistance. Every measure was a stand against the box Griffin tried to put her in. Every arpeggio rejection of every time someone assumed she wasn't capable, wasn't trained, wasn't worthy. And Griffin? He stopped filming. The smirk was gone. His eyes, once sharp of control, now searched the keys like they were betraying him, like the story he had tried to write was being rewritten by her hands. He looked around at the diners. They weren't looking at him. They weren't laughing with him. They were witnessing her. And he hated it, but he couldn't stop it, because the music only grew stronger. The notes swelled. Amira's posture relaxed into something otherworldly. Her fingers barely touched the keys, yet every sound that emerged was full, weighted with truth. Griffin leaned forward as if trying to get closer, to understand. He would fail, because this wasn't for him. It never was. This was for the kid bussing tables in the back, who stopped believing he could be more. For the single mom watching with tears in her eyes, remembering her own sacrifice. For the servers who'd been talked down to, tipped like they were invisible, told they were replaceable. This was for every moment Amira Wells had swallowed her voice so someone else could feel bigger. Now, she didn't need words. She had keys. The last notes of the first movement began to fall like rain. Soft, precise, devastating. And when they faded into silence, no one dared to breathe. You can take the girl off the stage, but you can't take the stage out of her soul. The final note from Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major hovered in the room like perfume. Impossible to hold, but lingering on skin, memory, and air. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence after Amira Wells played was not empty. It was full of wonder, of regret, of something sacred. And in that stillness, Amira's mind slipped back, not because she wanted to, but because music had always opened doors. Doors she usually kept locked. This time, the music pulled them wide open. She was 19 again. The auditorium smelled of old velvet and floor polish. Her hands were cold, the spotlight warm. Her black dress sparkled beneath the lights of Carnegie Hall, but her eyes were on the keys. Always the keys. The applause that night had been thunderous. And the letters afterward: Yale, Juilliard, Vienna Conservatory. Names that once felt like dreams now chased her. Critics didn't just praise her. They obsessed over her phrasing, her restraint, her fire. She plays like she's lived 100 lives. One reviewer had written. They didn't know how close they were to the truth. Because even then, at 19, Amira Wells had already learned how to hide pain beneath beauty. The memories shifted, like a camera refocusing. Suddenly, it was 5 years later. A hospital room. Fluorescent lights, white walls, and the soft beep of a heart monitor. Her mother, her hero, her teacher, her first audience, lay in the bed, voice a whisper, eyes too tired to stay open for long. Amira sat beside her. No stage, no spotlight, just a daughter, holding the hand of the woman who had once worked 2 jobs to afford piano lessons at a neighborhood art center in West Charleston. They used to count tips together at the kitchen table. Her mother folded bills and hummed gospel hymns while Amira practiced fingering exercises on a cheap keyboard with one broken G. When Amira got the call from her mother's oncologist, she was mid-rehearsal in New York. Her professor had been furious when she left early. She never returned. Back in the present, As the audience inside Magnolia sat suspended in reverence, Amira could still hear the creak of that hospital piano bench. Every night, after visiting hours ended, she'd sneak into the chapel and play. That old upright piano had missing ivories, a wobbly middle pedal, and a soul carved from grief. It didn't matter. She played for her mother's sleep. She played for herself. She played so she wouldn't break. The nurses never stopped her. Some of them came just to listen. One called her the midnight musician. When her mother passed, everything collapsed. Her savings went to medical bills. The scholarship offers had expired. The music world had moved on. And Amira? She stayed in Charleston, took the job at Magnolia, because it paid the rent, because it let her breathe, and because, secretly, she hoped she could disappear. She told herself she didn't miss the stage. She lied. Back inside Magnolia, Griffin Halstead sat frozen in his seat. He didn't understand what he was seeing. A woman he had mocked, a black waitress he tried to humiliate for sport, had just shattered his ego with a single piece of music. He'd set a trap. She'd turned it into a cathedral. And the worst part? He couldn't look away. Rose dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. She leaned toward Mateo and whispered, "That girl's hands. They remember everything." Tommy had stopped working completely. His phone sat on the host stand, live streaming. The comments were flooding in. Who is she? What did I just watch? This isn't a waitress. This is a prodigy. Amira opened her eyes. The applause hadn't started yet. That was the thing about true silence. It takes time to recover from. But she wasn't waiting for claps. She wasn't waiting for Griffin. She was remembering. She stood slowly, placed her hands in her lap, and gazed at the keys once more. This piano, silent for so many nights, just like her. Until now, she turned around, faces blurred, except for a few. The elderly couple at table 5. They were smiling, the woman mouthing the word, "Thank you." The young dishwasher in the corner had his hands clasped together like he was praying. And Griffin? He looked ashamed, trapped in his own silence. Good. Let him sit in it. She stepped away from the bench, moving slowly back toward her section, toward the trays, the menus, the life she had chosen. Not because she lacked talent, but because life had taken things from her. But tonight, she had taken something back. At Griffin's table, no one dared speak. The man who usually filled silence with sarcasm now had nothing to say. Then, finally, he opened his mouth. "Where did you learn play like that?" he asked. Amira paused, looked him in the eye, and said, "Where you assumed I never could." Some fights aren't fought with fists or fury. They begin with a single note that dares the world to listen differently. The thunder didn't come from the sky. It came from applause. It started in the back, quiet, like raindrops. Then a second, a third, until it swept across Magnolia and Company like a wave, rising from table to table, turning one-stiff spines into standing silhouettes. They weren't clapping for a waitress. They were clapping for a woman who had just set fire to the script someone else tried to write for her. Amira Wells stood next to the piano, her breathing measured, her hands still tingling from the memory of keys. She had just dismantled Griffin Halstead's performance trap and replaced it with her own, one that didn't seek validation from cash or cruelty. The room didn't erupt immediately because no one wanted to break the spell. But when it did, it was honest, it was earned, and it belonged entirely to her. The woman in the blue suit was the first to stand. She didn't wait for the others. She rose to her feet and applauded like she had just witnessed something holy. A man in a gray vest followed. Then the elderly couple, tears streaming, hands clapping. Then the kitchen door burst open and Chef Mateo, apron smeared with sauce and flour, walked out and slammed his hands together. Hard, loud. He didn't say a word. He just clapped. Griffin Halstead sat at his table. Like a man in a dream, he no longer controlled. He had planned a moment of humiliation, a joke, a spectacle. Instead, he had been outperformed, outclassed, and outlived by a woman he never saw coming. He reached for the stack of money still sitting on the piano lid, but hesitated. It looked smaller now, like a bribe no one wanted, like his failure, counted in hundreds. Amira didn't bow. She didn't wave. She simply smiled and turned back toward the server station like the moment hadn't just changed everything. But everything had. Tommy, standing at the host stand with a phone, still live streaming the scene, let out a sound between a laugh and a sob. The comment section was exploding. Who ISSHE? Hire her to play every night. This video just changed me. Justice with a side of Chopin. As she passed the wine rack, Rose met her with open arms and a tight squeeze. The old server's voice broke slightly. I knew there was something in you, she whispered, but I didn't know it was the whole damn symphony. Amira pulled back, blinking through a sheen of tears. I needed to remember who I was. No, honey, Rose said. You didn't remember. You reminded the rest of us. Back at his table, Griffin stood at last. His voice was quieter now. No projection. No theatrics. Just a bruised ego of a man trying to reclaim dignity he had never truly earned. He picked up the $10,000 stack of bills and walked toward her. For a moment, the entire restaurant watched, holding its collective breath. Was he going to apologize? Try to twist the narrative again? Buy his way out of humiliation? He stopped a few feet from her, held out the money. You earned this, he said quietly. Amira looked at the cash, then at Griffin, then beyond him, at the room full of faces still watching, still learning what power actually looked like. She reached out, took the stack with steady hands. Thank you, she said, but I'm not keeping it. He blinked. You're not. I'm starting a scholarship, she said, for black children who want to learn music but can't afford it. For every kid who thinks they need someone like you to tell them they're worthy. Gasps rippled through the room. Cheers followed, and someone, somewhere near the back, shouted, "That's how you build legacy." Griffin's face drained of color. His associates, once laughing sycophants, now stood at their seats, eyes low, ashamed. The woman in the blue suit pulled out her own wallet. "I'd like to contribute to that fund," she said. Others followed. Bills began stacking on the bar. Checks, cards, pledges. The night had turned from mockery to momentum. Griffin opened his mouth to say something, but words failed him. Instead, he turned slowly and walked back to his table, now conspicuously alone in a room where everyone else was on their feet for someone else. For her. Amira looked around. She wasn't shaking anymore. She wasn't small. She wasn't silent. She was seen. And the piano? It wasn't just an instrument anymore. It was a witness. To grief. To resilience. To justice that didn't scream, but played. As she returned to her shift, refilling water, checking on table 6, offering dessert menus. Nothing about her uniform had changed. But everything about how people saw her had. She wasn't the background. She was the chorus. The crescendo. The unexpected melody that stuck in your head long after the song had ended. He arrived expecting to own the room. He left trying not to disappear inside it. The applause had faded, but the echo of what had happened still clung to the walls of Magnolia and Company like smoke after a fire. Something sacred had been restored, and something poisonous had been exposed. And Griffin Halstead? He sat there, shoulders rigid, eyes fixed on the untouched glass of wine in front of him, while the world quietly moved on around him. For the first time in years, no one was listening to him. And worse, no one was afraid to look straight through him. Across the restaurant, Amira Wells carried herself like nothing had changed, like she hadn't just redefined the evening with 10 fingers and 88 keys. But everything had changed. She wasn't just seen now, she was witnessed. As she checked in with table 7, poured water for table 2, and smiled at a little girl who'd slipped out her seat to whisper, "You were amazing." There was a lightness in her steps. Not arrogance, not performance, freedom. Meanwhile, the table that once buzzed with Griffin's entitlement now sat in awkward purgatory. His companions had shifted away ever so slightly. Their bodies turned just enough to suggest polite detachment. The woman in the blue suit had already placed a contribution to the scholarship on the bar and excused herself to make a call, one that suspiciously sounded like a reschedule of their next working lunch. Another man, previously his loudest echo, now stirs espresso, as if it held the answer to how he'd ended up sitting beside a man who had just been publicly dismantled by Grace. Griffin exhaled, tried to sit up straighter, but posture couldn't protect him anymore. He glanced at the stack of money that no longer belonged to him, now split between hope and repentance, with contributions piling up behind the bar like quiet acts of revolution. He hated the way people looked at him now, not with fear, not even with anger, with pity. It gnawed at him like hunger. He pulled out his phone and looked at the screen, the live stream still open, but long overtaken by comments. This is what humility looks like. Money tried to humiliate her. Music turned it into purpose. He got played by the only person with real talent in the room. There were screenshots, clips, even slow motion edits of the moment Amira returned the money and said, "This will fund a scholarship." He had gone viral, but not the way he wanted. He stood, a little too suddenly. The room noticed, even if it pretended not to. He walked over to the piano again, not because he had anything to say, but because he was trying to find a way out of the story he no longer controlled. Amira noticed him approaching. She didn't move, didn't flinch, just met his gaze like she'd done 100 times before, but never with power like this. Griffin cleared his throat. His voice was softer now, less performative, but it still carried the residue of entitlement, like dust he couldn't shake. "I didn't know you were a professional." Amira tilted her head slightly. "You didn't ask." A beat passed. He looked at the piano, then back at her. "You should have said something." She smiled, not out of kindness, but clarity. "You don't hear people like me unless we perform, Mr. Halstead." The words hit harder than any insult, because they were true, and because everyone around them heard it too. For a man who once prided himself on commanding every room, he had been made irrelevant inside his own spectacle. He reached for the piano lid, touched it, then dropped his hand like it had burned him. "I'm leaving." It wasn't an announcement. It was an admission. He turned to walk out, slow, stiff, smaller than he'd entered. As he passed the bar, Tommy stepped aside, not out of respect, but to let the wind change direction. No one said goodbye. Back at the hostess stand, Rose turned to Mateo and whispered. That's the sound of a smirk turning to silence. Mateo nodded. "And it's the best music I've heard all night." Outside, Griffin pushed through the doors and stepped into the Charleston night, the street lamps casting him in harsh light. He didn't stop walking until the sound of the restaurant disappeared behind him. But the shame? It followed. Back inside, Amira stood next to the piano again, tracing the edge of the keys gently. She didn't play. Not yet. But the room felt different now. It wasn't just that people saw her. It was that they believed her. And in this world, in this industry, in this country, that meant everything. The little girl from earlier walked up to her table, tugging at her mother's sleeve. "Can she play again, Mommy?" The mother smiled, looking toward Amira. "I think she just might." Amira looked at the child, then the restaurant, then the piano. She didn't need an invitation. This time, the moment belonged to her. And when she sat down without pressure, without challenge, without eyes trying to devalue her, she began to play. Not Chopin, not Beethoven, not to prove anything, just to be. The music was lighter now, hopeful, a new beginning in every note. And as it filled the room, there were no smirks, only smiles, and silence that finally felt like peace. She didn't climb the stage. She built it one note at a time. The room didn't breathe, it swayed. Under the spell of Amira Wells's music, Magnolia and Company was no longer a restaurant. It had become something sacred. A place where judgment had been replaced by joy, and arrogance had finally surrendered to awe. The music she played wasn't listed in a program. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't even meant to impress. It was hers. Notes flowed like warm honey across cold marble floors, soft and rich and unexpectedly free. It wasn't about technical mastery anymore. It was about presence, the kind of presence that changed people just by being near it. Each keystroke was a memory, each phrase a reclamation. She didn't just play for herself. She played for the boy polishing glasses who had given up on music after one too many rejections. the line cook who had once dreamt of Broadway before bills took center stage. The guest who had never seen someone like her, a black waitress with callous hands and world-class grace. Remind them that talent didn't wear a name tag. She played for every room that had dismissed her. And for this one, that finally didn't. Near the kitchen, Chef Mateo had stopped cooking. Again, his towel over his shoulder, his arms crossed, eyes soft with something close to pride. He leaned toward Rose and said, "Do you feel that?" Rose nodded. She's lifting the whole damn ceiling. In the front, Tommy was still streaming. But now his camera shook, not from nerves, but from holding back emotion. "You're watching history," someone commented. "This is what art is supposed to do. If you're not crying right now, check your pulse." The music danced, then dipped, then rose again. And as Amira neared the final section, something shifted, not in the notes, but in the room. People began to rise. Not all at once. At first, just one woman at table 4, pressing her hand to her heart. Then a couple near the bar, standing slowly as if in church. Then another, and another, until every table, every guest, every member of the staff was on their feet, watching a woman they had nearly overlooked become the most unforgettable part of their lives. It was a standing ovation not born from obligation, but from reverence. And Amira, she didn't even see it, because her eyes were closed, not to block them out, but because she was inside the music, where she'd always been most alive. The last note rang out like a held breath finally released, and for one eternal moment, the room stood still, every heartbeat suspended. Then, an eruption, applause like thunder, cheering, tears, laughter, healing. Amira opened her eyes, blinking into the light, into the sound, into the impossible truth of what she had just done. She didn't smile right away. She let herself feel it, every second of it. The applause, the respect, the long overdue recognition, and the quiet part of herself, once buried under hospital ceilings and restaurant orders, that had just been resurrected. Mrs. Layton, the manager, rushed to the front, flustered but glowing, her voice almost cracking. "Amira," she said, Why didn't you ever tell us?" Amira stood from the bench, her apron still tied around her waist, her eyes shining. "I needed the job," she said, "but I stayed because this place gave me something I didn't know I was missing." "What's that?" Mrs. Layton asked. "A reason to keep playing, even if it wasn't on a stage." A boy, maybe 9, maybe 10, walked up to the piano, tugging on his father's jacket. "Can she play here every night?" The room chuckled warmly. Even Amira smiled. Mrs. Layton turned to her. "Actually, that's not a bad idea." The room lit up. Mrs. Layton placed a hand on Amira's shoulder. "If you'll have us, we'd be honored for you to be our featured pianist." Amira paused, then nodded. "I'll still work my shifts," she added. "The tips are good." That drew laughter, real joyful laughter. The kind that only happens when a room has been cracked wide open and filled with something better. Suddenly, a hand reached forward. Griffin Halstead, looking 10 years older than when he walked in, stepped up to the piano, the original stack of money in his hand, but he didn't lift his eyes. This belongs to you," he said, voice rough. Amira took the money, but only as a vessel. Then she turned to the room. "I'd like to use this," she said, "to start a music scholarship for black kids who dream like I used to, who just need a key to a locked door." There was a moment of stunned quiet, then another round of applause. This one louder, fiercer, deeper. It wasn't for the music. It was for the movement. One by one, diners walked up to the bar. Cash, checks, credit card slips. The donation stack began to grow, fast. And Griffin? He stepped back into the crowd, now just another man trying not to be seen. Amira stayed for another 2 hours. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. She played jazz standards between desserts, played lullabies for the family with the little girl, took a quiet moment to rest her hand on the piano and just breathe. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was running from something. She felt like she'd arrived. As she finally stepped out into the Charleston night, The street was quiet, the stars above her, soft and steady. She exhaled, and somewhere distant but distinct, she could still hear the echo of that last ovation. Not for a pianist, not for a waitress, for a woman who dared to be both, and more. She didn't choose between the stage and the service. She rewrote the stage. The next morning, the sun rose over Charleston like it always did, slow, gold, and unbothered by what had happened the night before. But inside Magnolia and Company, nothing was the same. The piano now sat like a crowned queen at the front of the room. No longer background furniture, no longer decoration. It had witnessed a war, and in its silence, it held the echo of Amira Wells's transformation. A laminated sign rested beside it now. Live piano performance by Amira Wells, evenings 7 p.m. But that wasn't the whole story. Not even close. That morning, as Amira walked through the doors in her usual pressed black shirt and apron, the room greeted her not with stares, but with nods, with warmth, with respect. Tommy waved from the host stand. "You're trending," he said, holding up his phone. "Millions of views." CNN already called. So did NPR. Amira blinked. "Wait, what?" "They want to interview you. Everyone does." She gave a soft laugh. "Guess I won't be invisible at the condiment station anymore." Tommy grinned. "You were never invisible. Just quiet." She thought for a second, then nodded. "I think I liked it that way, but maybe quiet was just a pause." As the morning rush settled in, coffee orders, brunch specials, the comforting clatter of a well-run kitchen, Mrs. Layton pulled Amira aside. "I spoke with the owner," she said. "He wants to offer you a contract. Full-time artist in residence, with full benefits, concert nights, and complete creative control." Amira blinked. "What about my shifts?" Mrs. Layton smiled. "You'll still be on the floor if you want. But this piano? It's yours now. You don't have to choose." Amira looked around to space she knew so well. The table where Rose used to fold napkins. The hallway where she'd once cried quietly during a phone call about her mother's biopsy results. The staff table where she had eaten cold soup and told herself she didn't miss a stage. This place had held her, and now it was letting her rise. That night, she played again. Not because someone challenged her, not because a smirk demanded it, but because she had something to say. The playlist wasn't classical. It was hers. Some Chopin, yes, but also Ella Fitzgerald, Oscar Peterson, a bit of Emma Hoyt-Segway Miriam Gebru, even a jazz variation on Beyoncé's Halo that had Rose wiping her eyes and laughing at the same time. It wasn't a concert. It was a conversation. Between sets, guests came up not to gawk, but to connect. "I played cello in college," one woman whispered. "I haven't touched it in 20 years. You made me want to go home and open the case." "My son wants to learn violin," another man said. "I told him it wasn't practical. Last night changed that." "And the kids?" "Oh!" The kids leaned over the piano railing like they were watching a magician. Amira showed one how to play a C chord. The little girl squealed when it rang out. "That's a beginning," Amira said softly. The scholarship fund was already growing. The original $10,000 had multiplied overnight. Griffin's associates had quietly added their contributions. The local arts council called. A retired jazz teacher mailed in a check with a note. "For every kid who thinks classical music doesn't look like them." Amira named it the Wells Legacy Fund in honor of her mother. Because she never played a note, Amira said, but she made the music possible. 1 week later, Amira was walking out after her set when a familiar voice called to her from the street. Griffin Halstead. He looked different, less tailored, less armored, more human. He held a folded check in his hand. "I came to apologize," he said. "I've spent my whole life measuring people by what they earn. You reminded me that some people create value that money can't even measure." Amira didn't smile, but she didn't sneer either. She took the check, opened it briefly, then handed it to Tommy. "Put it toward the scholarship," she said, then looked back at Griffin. "And next time you walk into a place like this, lead with your ears, not your wallet." He nodded. No protest. Just silence. The right kind of silence. Weeks turned into months. The restaurant flourished. So, did Amira. She released her first EP, recorded live, after hours at Magnolia, with a faint sound of plates and laughter still lingering in the background. Critics called it raw, beautiful, and necessary. But Amira didn't care about the reviews. She cared about the letters. From students. From teachers. From daughters taking their mothers to recitals. From boys in barbershops who downloaded Chopin after seeing a TikTok of that piano waitress. One night, after a show, Rose found her sitting alone at the piano. Fingers idle, eyes distant. "What are you thinking about?" Rose asked. Amira smiled softly. "I used to think I had to choose between who I used to be and who I became. But now I know." She touched the keys gently. "I can be both." Because the truth wasn't in choosing. It was in becoming. A waitress, a pianist, a daughter, a legacy. As the restaurant dimmed and the last customer waved goodbye, Amira played one final note into the empty room. It wasn't loud, but it lasted. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit like to show your love for Amira's courage. Subscribe to follow more stories where voices rise, silence is broken, and justice plays loud and clear. And share this video with someone who needs to be reminded. Greatness doesn't always wear a spotlight. It often waits in the quiet. Your support helps these untold stories reach the people who need them most. Let's amplify voices that refuse to be ignored.